Today, we are plunging into something truly immense: the history and culture of India. It's a subject that spans millennia and just layers upon layers of human experience.
Absolutely. Trying to get a handle on it can feel overwhelming. Yeah. Like looking at a mosaic with millions of pieces.
Exactly. And that's why we've pulled together a whole range of sources for this. Everything from detailed historical accounts and, academic analysis on law, administration, education,
Right.
to cultural studies, and even recent large-scale survey data on religion and society.
It gives us lots of different angles on this vast story.
It really is. So our mission here, what we want to do is synthesize all of this for you. We want to cut through the sheer volume and really pull out the fundamental key insights, the dominant themes that keep coming up, and, the significant details that truly matter.
Yeah, the goal is to give you a clear, structured overview, something that provides context and is actually relevant for understanding India today.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe. A shortcut to a robust understanding, focusing on the substantive content and how it all connects. Right? We're going to travel through time, from prehistory way back all the way to the present day. We'll explore how political structures evolved, economies shifted, societies got organized, cultures flourished, and how external forces really left their mark.
So where do we start? The very beginning.
Let's begin right there.
Well, the sources, they remind us just how incredibly ancient the story is. The Indian subcontinent has evidence of human activity dating back over 250,000 years.
Wow. 250,000 years.
Yeah. That provides this incredibly deep, prehistoric indigenous foundation. You can sort of see echoes of this deep past in prehistoric art, like the fascinating paintings found at the rock shelters of Bhimbetka.
That really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Millennia before cities or anything like written records.
Yeah, exactly. So, moving forward from that deep past, one of the earliest complex urban cultures we see emerge globally is the Indus Valley Civilization, flourishing around, 3300 BCE?
And this was a seriously sophisticated society for its time.
Oh, absolutely. The sources highlight incredible urban planning. Really well laid out cities, sophisticated sewage and drainage systems, frankly, remarkable even by some modern standards, and impressive architectural feats like the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro.
And they weren't just stuck in their own valley, were they?
Not at all. We see clear evidence of established trade links stretching as far as Mesopotamia, back in the 3rd millennium BCE.
That far back?
Yep. They had a complex society, even developed a writing system, which, interestingly, we still haven't fully deciphered.
Still holding on to its secrets. That's amazing.
It remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world, yeah.
And its decline. Around 1900 BCE, what's the thinking there?
Well, one of the main hypotheses the sources mention points towards environmental factors, possibly a prolonged drought, maybe lasting 200 years or so.
A 200-year drought, that would do it.
Yeah, environmental shifts often play a huge role in these ancient civilizational changes. So following the decline of the Indus Valley, roughly after 1500 BCE, we enter what's called the Vedic period.
Okay.
This is marked by the arrival and spread of Indo-Aryan languages, most notably Sanskrit, spreading across northern India.
And with this period, we start seeing the groundwork being laid for, early legal traditions.
That's right. You find them reflected primarily in the Vedic texts themselves, and then later they get codified in works like the Dharmashastras.
Dharmashastras, like Manusmriti.
Exactly. Manusmriti is a key example. Think of these as, comprehensive legal and social codes for their time. They laid down rules covering pretty much everything: social conduct, property rights, inheritance, even principles of criminal justice.
Right.
And what's really key is that these principles were often deeply intertwined with religious beliefs and the emerging social hierarchy, the caste system.
That close link law, religion, society seems fundamental right from early on. What about education in this period? How do people learn?
Well, early educational systems were quite distinct from what we might recognize today. You had the traditional Gurukula system, for instance.
Gurukula.
Yeah, it wasn't a school like we think of it. It was residential. Students would literally live with their guru, their teacher, for years.
Wow, so a really immersive experience.
Totally. The focus was intense study of texts, the Vedas, the Vedangas, the great epics, philosophy, logic, mathematics. But it wasn't just about cramming knowledge,
No.
No, it emphasized self-discipline, communal living, even practices like going out to seek alms for sustenance.
So less about getting a job later and more about personal development.
Precisely. Sources describe it as aiming for man-making education. The idea was cultivating character, inner potential, understanding one's duties rather than purely, say, mundane material goals.
That's a really different way of thinking about the purpose of learning. And there were other kinds of learning centers too, right?
Yes, absolutely. Buddhist viharas and later Islamic madrasas became really important centers of knowledge, and these were often more open to broader society than the traditional Gurukulas.
Okay.
And the sources note a significant shift towards institutionalization here. Learners started identifying more with the institution itself, like saying, I belong to Nalanda or Taxila.
A bit like saying you went to Oxford or Harvard today.
Kind of, yeah. And it's interesting how the state or the rulers started playing a more direct role in these viharas, both academically and even financially. That kind of early state intervention in education is quite notable.
And these centers grew into something bigger.
Yes. This process of collecting and systematizing knowledge led to what the sources describe as early universities emerging from these teacher compendiums. Taxila, which is in modern-day Pakistan, is probably the most famous ancient center mentioned.
Now, something that often comes up regarding this early period is the debate around caste and access to education.
Yeah, it's a complex area. While the Vedic texts themselves give us clues, there's definitely scholarly debate on the exact nature and application of the caste system during the earliest Vedic times.
Right.
However, the sources are pretty clear that in the later Brahminic system, caste rigidities really did deeply impact education. Unfortunately, it marginalized large sections of society from being able to access these learning opportunities.
Okay, so we've got these ancient foundations, early structures for law and learning. How did things evolve politically into larger states?
Well, we see a clear transition. From these sort of tribal assemblies or rashtra that are mentioned in the Iron Age, we move towards the second urbanization period, roughly, say, 600 to 200 BCE.
Second urbanization.
Yeah. And this era saw the rise of the 16 major Mahajanapadas.
Mahajanapadas. What does that mean?
Often translated as great realms or great kingdoms, these were significant regional powers. They emerged from earlier, smaller entities consolidating power. The sources highlight one in particular, Magadha, south of the Ganges River, as eventually becoming described as all-powerful during this time. It basically absorbed many of its neighbors.
And building on Magadha's power, then came the Nanda Dynasty.
Yes, around 343 BCE, founded by a figure named Mahatma Nanda. He's a fascinating character, actually. Sources describe him rising to power not through, royal birth, but through sheer military skill and political smarts.
Really?
Yeah, apparently even assassinating the last ruler of the previous dynasty. He's noted as originally being a cowherder, which shows there was some path to power outside the traditional elite even back then.
A real, well, maybe not self-made man, but certainly a powerful figure from humble origins. What was the impact of the Nandas?
Even though their rule was relatively brief, it was pretty significant. They're noted for establishing a much more centralized administration, a robust bureaucracy, and developing an advanced taxing system for the time. Plus, they commanded a vast army, showing real state capacity.
And this centralization seems like it paved the way for the huge Maurya Empire that followed.
Absolutely. Established during the same second urbanization era, the Maurya Empire was really the first to unify a significant chunk of the subcontinent under one rule.
Okay.
Under emperors like the famous Ashoka, it was truly massive. Sources estimate it covered around 5 million square kilometers at its peak.
5 million.
Yeah, governing something like 50 million people.
That's just a staggering scale for that time period. How on earth did they manage such a vast territory?
Well, the sources, particularly relying on the Arthashastra, which is this incredibly detailed treatise on statecraft from that era, they describe a highly centralized administration.
Arthashastra, right.
Yeah. They had well-defined departments for things like revenue, public works, trade, even espionage, and a pretty sophisticated justice system. And Ashoka's famous edicts, carved on pillars and rocks all across his empire, they weren't just like religious messages. They were essentially public communication, administrative instructions, policy announcements coming straight from the central government.
So a level of administrative sophistication that was centuries ahead of its time in many parts of the world.
Exactly. I mean, the blueprints laid out in the Arthashastra offer lasting lessons in governance, really.
So what happened after the Mauryas? Their empire declined around 184 BCE.
So after that, we see a period where regional kingdoms start emerging again. Powers like the Satavahanas, the Kushanas, They often built upon some of the Mauryan administrative precedents, but maybe with a bit less centralization sometimes.
And this eventually leads us to a period often called the Golden Age.
Ah, yes, the Gupta Empire, flourishing roughly from 320 to 550 CE. It's widely described in the sources as a classical period or a golden age.
Why golden?
Well, they're noted for really efficient administration, but also remarkable patronage of arts, sciences, and literature. This was the era of giants like the playwright Kalidasa, the mathematician Aryabhata, the astronomer Varahamihira.
Wow, okay, so major intellectual and cultural output.
Exactly, and that term Golden Age often points to that, plus the relative stability they brought through their military unification efforts, sometimes called Pax Gupta. Their cultural influence was immense, spreading even to nearby kingdoms.
Interesting.
And it's also interesting that while the Gupta rulers performed traditional Vedic sacrifices, they also actively patronized Buddhism, showing a degree of, religious pluralism.
Now, while all this was happening with these big empires in the north, the sources make it clear that powerful, independent kingdoms were also thriving down south.
Oh, critically important to remember, yes. Dynasties, like the Cholas, who rose from the mid-9th century onwards, were incredibly powerful.
Cholas. Yeah.
They weren't just known for their land armies. They had a formidable navy that projected their influence all the way into Southeast Asia. They were major military, economic, and cultural forces responsible for absolutely breathtaking temple architecture, like the Brihadiswar Temple in Thanjavur.
Amazing. And the Vijayanagara Empire.
Yeah.
That was later, right?
Yes, Vijayanagara from the 14th to 17th centuries, another major southern power, particularly known for its strong military might, holding its own against the northern sultanates for a long time.
And their capital city.
Supposedly magnificent. Their architecture is exemplified by temples like the Vithala and Hazararama. They were also great patrons of arts and literature. Their eventual fall in 1565 to a confederacy of Deccan Muslim sultanates was a really significant turning point in the region.
It sounds like this whole historical tapestry is never static. It's just marked by constant churn, conflict, absorption.
Absolutely. The sources really highlight a recurring pattern throughout these periods, from the Mahajanapas onwards through the Sultanates and Mughals. Smaller political entities are constantly being absorbed into larger empires, or they become subordinate vassals,
Right.
And internally, these empires themselves were often grappling with conflict.
What kind of internal conflicts were we talking about?
Oh, things like dynastic struggles, who gets the throne next, factionalism within the Delhi Sultanate, brutal wars of succession among the Mughal princes, and then constant rivalries between the myriad of smaller princely states that dotted the landscape. It was an incredibly dynamic and often very volatile political scene.
And just before the British really consolidated their power, there was another major player, the Maratha Empire.
Yes, the Marathas. They were known for their very effective use of guerrilla tactics, and they carved out this vast empire that, at its peak, stretched across a huge part of the subcontinent.
A real challenge to the Mughals.
A major challenge to decaying Mughal authority, and later a significant obstacle for the British. However, their power started to wane after a series of intense conflicts, eventually leading to their defeat in the Anglo-Maratha Wars, which ended around 1818.
And that defeat really cleared the path for the British East India Company.
Pretty much, yeah. It effectively removed the last major Indian rival, allowing the company to become the dominant political power across most of India.
Which brings us neatly to the impact of external forces. And as you said, this isn't just about European colonialism. India has a very long history of contact with the outside world.
Indeed. You just have to look at a map. India's strategic location in the Indian Ocean along major land routes meant it was connected to other civilizations from incredibly early on. We see evidence of this way back in the Indus Valley period, with trade links stretching back to maybe 2000 BCE.
So who were some of these earlier foreign contacts before the Europeans?
Well, you had Persian Achaemenid incursions into the northwestern parts of the subcontinent back in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Then, famously, Alexander the Great's invasion around 327 BCE.
Alexander in India.
Yeah, though his campaign was relatively brief, it led to significant contact with the Hellenistic world. You can see this influence in art, particularly Gandhara art, which blends Greco-Roman styles with Buddhist themes, also in coinage, and it even led to the establishment of Indo-Greek kingdoms in the northwest for a while.
So Greek influence, tangible Greek influence in India. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a real fusion. And beyond that, There was significant sea trade with the Roman Empire, starting around the 1st century BCE.
Yeah.
Spices, textiles, other luxury goods flowing west, room and gold coming east.
All right.
And then you have the Kushanas, a dynasty that originated in Central Asia, ruling parts of North India from the 1st to 3rd century CE. They played a crucial role in facilitating the Silk Road trade and the cultural exchange that came with it.
So it's this constant pattern. External ideas, people, goods coming in, interacting with the existing cultures, changing things.
Exactly. And that continues into the medieval period. We mentioned the Arab conquest of Sind in 712 CE.
Yeah.
That was the first significant Muslim political entry. But Arab maritime traders had been active along the Indian coasts for centuries before that.
Okay.
Then later, the Turkic and Afghan invasions that led to the Delhi Sultanate and subsequently the Mughal Empire, founded by Babu from Central Asia. These were also incredibly powerful external forces that profoundly reshaped the political and cultural landscape, bringing significant Persianate influences.
Which eventually leads us, then, to the arrival of the Europeans.
Right. European powers, the Portuguese first. Then the Dutch, French, and British start arriving from the late 15th century onwards. Initially, they were primarily drawn by the incredibly lucrative spice trade.
Just traders at first.
Mostly, yes. But the British East India Company, which was essentially a private trading corporation, gradually transformed itself into a political power from the mid-18th century onwards, cleverly exploiting local rivalries and using its military force to assert dominance.
And that culminated in the period known as the British Raj.
Yes, exactly. Following the large-scale rebellion in 1857, sometimes called the Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Independence, the British Crown took direct control of India from the East India Company. This period of direct British rule, the Raj, lasted from 1858 right up until 1947.
And this colonial experience, it just fundamentally transformed India, didn't it? Let's unpack that impact a bit. Politically, what changed?
Well, traditional Indian political structures, whether they were large empires or smaller kingdoms, were largely dismantled or co-opted, basically absorbed into the new British administrative framework. The British created a centralized state and imposed new administrative division, provinces, districts right across the subcontinent.
Right.
But interestingly, the sources point out a significant irony here.
Which is?
By creating a common oppressor and a single, unified administrative entity covering most of the landmass, the British inadvertently helped to strengthen the very idea of a single, unified India among the diverse population.
Huh. That's a really key point. Unity emerging in part from shared resistance against a common ruler. Was there any Indian representation at all in the political system under the Raj?
Very, very limited, especially early on. After the 1857 rebellion, acts like the Indian Councils Act did allow for some nominated Indian members in legislative councils, but the sources note these positions were overwhelmingly given to loyal members of the landed aristocracy, not really representatives of the general population. They were seen by the British essentially as safety valves to vent steam.
Okay, what about the economic impact of British rule? That sounds huge.
Oh, profound. India was effectively integrated into the burgeoning global capitalist economy, but primarily on Britain's terms as a supplier of cheap raw materials for British industries, like cotton, jute, indigo, and as a captive market for British manufactured goods.
And the effect on local industries?
Devastating for many. It led to the de-industrialization of India's traditional artisanal industries. Textiles are the classic example, contributing significantly to widespread poverty for weavers and other craftspeople. New class structures also emerged, tied to this colonial economy.
Was any modern industry actually developed in India during this time?
Yes, some did begin to emerge, but it was limited and came relatively late compared to Britain's own industrial revolution. Modern industries like cotton textiles in mills, jute processing, and eventually steel did start to develop in the late 19th century. You see significant Indian ventures like the Tata Iron and Steel Company, founded in 1907.
The British are also often credited with building a lot of infrastructure, especially the railways.
They certainly did build extensive infrastructure. The railway network, starting in 1853, became vast, along with roads, canals, telegraph lines. However, the sources consistently emphasized that this development was primarily driven by British economic and military needs.
How so?
Getting raw materials like cotton out to the ports efficiently for export to Britain Britain and moving British manufactured goods and troops quickly into the interior. What's critical and often overlooked is that the risks and the enormous costs for building this infrastructure, estimated at a staggering $50 million by 1920, were largely borne by Indian taxpayers, who were predominantly poor farmers and laborers.
Right, so Indians paid for infrastructure that mainly served British interests.
Largely, yes. And despite this massive investment in infrastructure, very little skilled employment was created for Indians themselves. The sources note that by 1920, only about 10% of the superior posts, the managerial and engineering jobs in the vast railway network, were held by Indians.
That disparity in who benefited is really stark. And the sources also seem to link the colonial administration to an increase in the severity and frequency of large-scale famines, particularly in the late 19th century.
Yes, that period saw multiple, truly devastating famines where tens of millions of people died. It's a deeply tragic and highly controversial part of the colonial legacy. Critics at the time, and much subsequent historical analysis, have linked the severity of these famines, at least in part, to colonial policies, things like revenue demands, export of food grains, and disruption of traditional coping mechanisms.
Weren't there some efforts to address famine?
There were. Infrastructure like railways did eventually aid famine relief efforts in some areas, and commercial cropping increased food production in certain newly irrigated regions. Measures like the Indian Famine Code were introduced in 1880. But the overall picture, the administrative response, and the underlying causes remain highly contentious areas of historical debate.
Okay, turning to the social impact. How did colonialism reshape Indian society on that level?
While colonial policies sometimes actively exacerbated existing social divisions, particularly those related to caste and religion, a key example often cited is the introduction of separate electorates for different religious communities and the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, which critics argue institutionalized religious difference in politics.
And education.
The British introduced Western-style education, most notably through Macaulay's Minute in 1835, which promoted English as the medium of instruction for higher education, and the establishment of universities from 1857 onwards. This certainly created a new English-educated elite who played key roles later, but it came largely at the expense of developing mass primary education for the general population, which remained neglected.
And this period also saw the rise of important social reform movements from within India, didn't it, responding to some of these issues?
Absolutely. It wasn't just about British impact. It was also a time of intense internal debate and reform. Figures like Pandita Ramabai advocated powerfully for women's rights, including education and widow remarriage. Within the broader nationalist surge, individuals like Gopal Krishna Gokhale and organizations such as the Servants of India Society worked tirelessly for legislative change and directly with marginalized communities, challenging practices like untouchability.
So the colonial period wasn't just a one-way street. It was also about Indian responses, resistance, and movements for internal change. Culturally, what was the legacy?
The introduction of the English language and Western institutions had a profound and, frankly, lasting impact on culture, administration, and thought. While some aspects of Indian culture were unfortunately denigrated or dismissed under colonial rule, there was also simultaneously a powerful Renaissance movement emerging from within India itself. This sought to revive, reform, and vigorously assert the value of Indian traditions, knowledge, and identity in the face of colonial dominance.
All of these complex forces, the economic exploitation, the political control, the social changes, the internal reform movements, the cultural responses, they all set the stage for the growing anti-colonial movement and that long, difficult road to independence.
Exactly. This was a period of intensifying struggle, fueled by incredibly powerful leaders who managed to mobilize millions of people across the diverse subcontinent. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi, of course, often called the father of the nation, became global symbols of nonviolent resistance.
And others were crucial too.
Absolutely. Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, B.R. Ambedkar, these were all crucial figures in not just fighting for independence, but also in shaping the vision for the future nation. And later, leaders like Indira Gandhi, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Narendra Modi continued to shape post-independence India.
And the sources show the independence movement wasn't just one single thing, right? It included many different ideologies and groups.
Definitely not monolithic. While the Indian National Congress, founded back in 1885, played the leading role in the mainstream independence struggle, the sources make it clear there were many other important movements active. Socialist groups, communist parties, Dalit movements fighting caste oppression, Dravidian movements asserting regional identity in the South, environmental concerns starting to emerge, women's rights organizations, and also Hindu nationalist movements advocating for a Hindu-centric state, often termed Hindutva.
That's a lot of different strands.
It is. And it's worth noting that the Indian National Congress, at least officially, consciously, attempted to distance itself from explicitly socio-religious identity politics, aiming for a more secular, inclusive platform.
What were some of the key events or turning points that marked milestones on that path to independence?
Well, the Partition of Bengal back in 1905 was a really significant one. It was widely seen, even then, as a deliberate divide-and-rule strategy by the British Viceroy, Lord Curzon, aimed at weakening the growing Bengali nationalist movement.
But it backfired.
Ironically, yes, it ended up galvanizing the organized anti-colonial movement across India like never before, leading to widespread protests under the Swadeshi movement. Although Bengal was later reunified in 1911, the episode left deep scars. What else? The Government of India Act of 1919 introduced something called diarchy, a kind of limited power sharing in the provinces between elected Indian ministers and British governors. But it was heavily criticized by Indian leaders as being far too limited, falling well short of self-government.
And the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, that seems like a moment where many lost any remaining faith in British intentions or justice?
Absolutely a watershed moment. Colonel Reginald Dyer's order to his troops to fire, without warning, on a large, peaceful, unarmed gathering trapped in an enclosed space in Amritsar, killing hundreds, including women and children, was a brutal act that sent shockwaves of horror and anger across the entire nation.
A major catalyst.
Huge. It was a major catalyst for Gandhi launching his first nationwide non-cooperation movement shortly afterwards, from 1920 to 1922, urging Indians to boycott British goods, institutions, and administration.
Okay. Moving forward, what about the Government of India Act 1935?
That act offered significantly more autonomy to the provinces, a definite step towards self-governance at that level. However, the proposed federal structure at the national level, which was meant to include the princely states, got stalled due to disagreements, particularly from the princes themselves who were wary of losing power.
How did World War II impact the whole independence struggle? It must have been complex.
Incredibly complex. On one hand, the Indian Army became the world's largest all-volunteer force during the war, numbering around 2.5 million men who served bravely in various campaigns across the globe, from North Africa and Italy to Burma.
But domestically?
Domestically, India suffered the devastating Bengal famine in 1943, where millions died. The causes and the role of wartime administration remain intensely debated and controversial. Politically, the British sent the Cripps Mission in 1942, offering India potential dominion status after the war in return for support during it.
How'd that go down?
It failed. Indian leaders rejected it, demanding immediate steps towards independence. This led directly to Gandhi launching the Quit India movement in August 1942, calling for immediate British withdrawal. The British response was swift and harsh mass arrests of Congress leaders, including Gandhi and Nehru, and widespread suppression of protests.
And there was another strand during the war, too, wasn't there, with Subhas Chandra Bose?
Yes, the sources also note the distinct and controversial path taken by Subhas Chandra Bose. He disagreed with Gandhi's nonviolence, escaped house arrest, and sought alliances with Axis powers Germany and Japan, believing they could help India gain independence from Britain. He formed the Indian National Army, INA, largely from Indian prisoners of war held by the Japanese, to fight alongside them against the British in Southeast Asia.
So all these intense pressures, movements, and the impact of the war finally culminated in that momentous but also incredibly difficult and painful event of partition.
Yes, the partition of India took place on August 14th and 15th, 1947. It marked the formal end of the British Raj and led simultaneously to the creation of two independent nations, the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan.
And this division, it was based largely on religious demographics, wasn't it?
Primarily, yes. The division, particularly the partitioning of the large religiously mixed provinces of Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east, was based significantly on drawing lines according to the district-wise majorities of Muslims and non-Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs.
And the human cost was just immense.
Horrific. The sources describe massive panic displacement estimates vary, but perhaps 7 to 8 million Hindus and Sikhs fled from what became Pakistan into India, and around 10 million Muslims moved from India to Pakistan. And amidst this chaos, there was horrific communal violence riots, massacres, abductions that claimed countless lives, maybe up to 1 million or even more. It was a deeply traumatic birth for both nations.
And Jawaharlal Nehru was sworn in as the first Prime Minister of independent India.
Yes, amidst both the joy of freedom and the tragedy of partition.
A truly turbulent and painful start for the modern nation. Let's look at the trajectory of post-independence India now, starting with its political landscape.
Well, right after independence, you had Nehru as the primary architect, really laying the groundwork for modern India's political system, parliamentary democracy, secularism, and its initial economic path. Alongside him, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel played an absolutely crucial role in integrating the hundreds of quasi-independent princely states into the Indian Union.
That must have been a huge task.
A remarkable feat of diplomacy, persuasion, and sometimes pressure, achieved relatively quickly. And then you have B.R. Ambedkar, himself a leader from the Dalit community, formerly known as Untouchables, who was the principal architect of India's constitution, adopted in 1950, which enshrined fundamental rights and aimed to abolish untouchability.
One of the early major political decisions after the Constitution was reorganizing the states internally.
Yes. The linguistic reorganization of states in the 1950s was a massive undertaking, redrawing the internal map of India based primarily on the dominant language spoken in each region.
Why did they do that?
The aim was largely to satisfy regional aspirations and reduce potential conflict based on language. In many ways, it succeeded, but it also sometimes led to localized tensions and new movements, like the strong anti-Hindi agitations that occurred in some southern states who feared Hindi imposition.
And internal conflicts didn't just disappear after independence and reorganization, did they?
No. Unfortunately not. The sources note a continuation of various internal conflicts. Issues stemming from that linguistic reorganization lingered in some areas. There have been various separatist movements over the decades demanding independence or greater autonomy, notably related to Khalistan and Punjab, ongoing issues in Kashmir, and various insurgencies in the Northeast. Plus, the Naxalite insurgency, a Maoist-inspired movement primarily in rural tribal areas. And sadly, periodic bouts of communal violence between religious groups have continued to pose challenges.
Okay, let's shift to the economy. What was the initial approach after 1947?
The early decades, largely influenced by Nehru's vision, saw a focus on what's often called import substitution industrialization. The idea was to build up India's own industrial base, particularly in heavy industries like steel, power, machinery, largely under state control or guidance. This is often referred to as Nehruvian socialism, and it was implemented through a series of 5-year plans.
Was it successful?
Mixed results, like any complex policy, it did build a significant industrial base. A major success story from this era, though, was the Green Revolution, starting in the mid-1960s.
The Green Revolution, right? Agriculture.
Exactly. It dramatically boosted agricultural production, particularly wheat and rice, through the widespread adoption of new high-yielding variety, HYV seeds, increased use of chemical fertilizers, and significant expansion of irrigation infrastructure. It helped India achieve food self-sufficiency, which was a major goal.
But there was a really major shift in economic policy later on, wasn't there?
Yes, a huge turning point occurred in 1991. India was facing a severe balance of payments crisis, basically. It was running out of foreign currency to pay for essential imports. This crisis forced the government at the time to implement major economic reforms.
Liberalization.
Exactly. Liberalizing the economy became the new mantra. This involved dismantling many of the controls and licenses that had restricted private industry, often called the license Raj, significantly reducing high import tariffs, opening up many sectors to private and foreign investment, and generally moving towards a more market-oriented economy.
And the impact of those 1991 reforms has been pretty dramatic.
Undeniably. India has since emerged as a major global economic powerhouse. Annual GDP growth has averaged around 6–7% for much of the period since 1991, making it one of the fastest-growing large economies in the world for decades.
And the structure of the economy changed too?
Very much so. The economy has increasingly shifted towards a service sector focus. Areas like information technology, IT, software exports, business process outsourcing, and finance have become major drivers of growth. Strengthening the manufacturing sector remains a key policy priority, though, with initiatives like Make in India aiming to boost domestic production.
But that impressive growth story isn't the whole picture, is it? The sources point to persistent challenges.
No, absolutely not the whole picture, and the sources are quite clear on this. Significant challenges definitely persist. High levels of income inequality are a major concern. Substantial levels of poverty remain, although the percentage has fallen. The sources mention around 10% of the population were still below the international poverty line of $2.15 a day in 2021.
What else?
Unemployment, particularly among youth, is a persistent issue. Ongoing agrarian distress affects large parts of the rural population. There are significant infrastructure deficits, issues with corruption, and growing environmental concerns related to pollution and resource depletion.
So it's a mix of opportunity and challenge.
Very much so. The opportunities are huge. India has a large and young population, offering a potential demographic dividend if they can be educated and employed. There's a growing middle class driving consumption, proven strength in IT and services, potential for manufacturing growth, increasing foreign investment, and rapid digital transformation happening.
But the benefits aren't evenly spread.
That's the key point. The benefits of this high growth have not been evenly distributed. There are significant disparities between urban and rural areas and between different regions. Many people working in the large informal sector have seen fewer gains compared to those in the formal economy. Government policies like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, NRGA, which provides work, direct cash transfers to the poor, and the implementation of the Goods and Services Tax, GST, aim to address some of these inequalities and boost inclusive growth. But it remains a major ongoing challenge.
Let's look at demographics more broadly. The population itself has grown exponentially since independence.
Oh, dramatically. The population has grown from around 361 million back in the 1951 census to an estimated 1.42 billion or more in 2021, making India the world's most populous country.
But fertility rates are falling.
Yes, significantly since the 1980s. The total fertility rate has fallen below replacement level in many parts of the country now. This decline is strongly linked to factors like increasing urbanization, rising levels of female education, and wider access to family planning methods.
And migration plays a really big part in shaping the country internally and externally.
Huge part. Both internal and international migration are major forces. Internally, we see significant interstate migration, often driven by economic disparities, people moving from relatively poorer agrarian regions towards states with more industrial or service sector opportunities. Large numbers move from states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh to places like Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Delhi, which profoundly reshapes urban landscapes and demographics.
And people leaving India.
International migration is also substantial, particularly the large diaspora in the Gulf states, North America, the UK, and elsewhere. Remittances sent back by these migrants contribute significantly to the Indian economy. The source is estimated at around $90 billion annually recently. And historically, India has also been a recipient of significant refugee flows over the years, most notably during partition, but also Sri Lankan Tamils fleeing civil war and Tibetan exiles after the Chinese takeover in 1959.
Language is another incredibly rich and diverse layer of India. How did that landscape evolve?
It's fundamental to India's identity, isn't it? In the north, you see the long evolution of the Indo-Aryan languages, tracing their roots back through various Prakrits and Apabhramshas, ultimately to Sanskrit. In the south, the distinct Dravidian language family solidified its own rich literary traditions very early on.
And external influences impacted language, too.
Absolutely. Persian became the administrative and court language under the Delhi Sultanate and the early Mughals, leading to the development of Urdu as a major language blending Persian, Arabic, Turkic, and local Indic vocabulary. Then, under the British, English was introduced and became crucial for administration, higher education, and upward mobility, a role it still retains alongside Hindi and regional languages.
Which led to the current official language situation.
Right. The linguistic reorganization of states after independence, basing state boundaries largely on dominant languages, ultimately led to the 22 languages currently recognized as official languages in the Constitution's 8th schedule. While this has undoubtedly fostered regional pride and identity, it has also at times resulted in linguistic tensions and chauvinism, particularly around the role of Hindi.
Okay. Turning quickly to military and security, India's armed forces are among the world's largest today.
Yes, post-independence, India has built very substantial armed forces, consistently ranked among the largest globally in terms of active personnel. India is also a declared nuclear weapon state, having conducted nuclear tests first in 1974 and then again in 1998.
What's the focus for the military?
The focus is generally on modernization of equipment, defending the country's long and contested borders, conducting counterinsurgency operations internally, and also contributing significantly to international peacekeeping efforts under the UN. Addressing internal conflicts typically involves a combination of negotiation, economic development initiatives, and deployment of security forces.
Finally, before we move to culture, how has India positioned itself on the global stage since 1947? What's been its foreign policy approach?
Well, in the early decades, particularly under Nehru's leadership, India championed a policy of non-alignment. The idea was to maintain independence and strategic autonomy by keeping an equal distance, formally at least, from the two major Cold War superpowers, the US and the USSR.
But did it stay perfectly non-aligned?
In practice, its foreign policy did tilt somewhat towards the Soviet bloc, especially after the brief but impactful border war with China in 1962, which soured relations with China for decades and led India to seek closer ties with the USSR for strategic support.
Relations with neighboring Pakistan and China have obviously been central and often difficult.
Deeply complex and frequently strained, yes. Relations with Pakistan have unfortunately oscillated between periods of attempted détente, like the Shimla Agreement or the Lahore Declaration, and outright hostility, including several wars, frequently centered on the unresolved and highly sensitive dispute over Kashmir. Relations with China saw significant improvement after the early 1990s, with efforts to normalize ties and build economic links, leading to agreements like the Strategic and Cooperative Partnership in 2003. However, underlying border disputes remain unresolved, and recent years have seen renewed tensions and serious border skirmishes, straining the relationship considerably again.
So in the post-Cold War era, has India's approach evolved beyond non-alignment?
Yes, definitely. It's often described now not as non-alignment, but as multi-alignment, or pursuing strategic autonomy in a multipolar world. India seeks to build strong, pragmatic relationships with multiple major global powers simultaneously, based on converging interests.
So partnerships with different powers.
Exactly. This includes significantly deepening strategic and defense ties with the United States, notably marked by the landmark Civil Nuclear Agreement in 2008, while also maintaining its long-standing defense cooperation with Russia. India is also strengthening economic and strategic links with the European Union, Japan, and other powers in Asia and beyond.
And regionally.
India was a founding member of SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, though that organization has often been hampered by India-Pakistan tensions. More recently, India has become an active strategic partner in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, an informal grouping with the US, Japan, and Australia, which is widely seen by observers, though not always explicitly stated, as a way to counterbalance China's growing military and economic influence in the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, so that's a whirlwind tour through the political, economic, and strategic landscape. All of this history is interwoven with the incredibly rich and dynamic culture of India. How did the sources frame that?
Well, Indian culture is described not as some static, monolithic thing, but as a dynamic, incredibly complex whole. It encompasses, knowledge, beliefs, customs, art, everything. What's often highlighted as remarkable is how it manages to blend deeply rooted traditions, going back millennia, with cutting-edge modernity.
Like scientists and ancient customs coexisting.
Exactly. You see prominent scientists and engineers working on global frontiers, alongside the continuation of ancient customs, rituals, and social practices. It resonates with broader ideas about how civilizations and cultures develop and adapt over time, like those explored by pioneering cultural historians such as Carl Jacob Christoph Burckhardt.
A fundamental aspect seems to be its composite character. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's absolutely essential to understanding India. Its culture is fundamentally composite. It's the result of centuries upon centuries of different peoples with varied racial stocks, diverse ethnic backgrounds, different religious beliefs intermingling, interacting, absorbing elements from each other, and influencing each other. This continuous process of synthesis is what has created its incredible richness, resilience, and adaptability.
And two defining features that keep coming up in the sources are continuity and diversity.
Yes, those are the twin pillars, really. Indian culture has shown this remarkable capacity for continuity, preserving core traditions and values across millennia, despite immense historical upheavals, invasions, and changes. But equally defining, perhaps even more visibly so, is its vast diversity.
In what ways?
The sheer variety is stunning. Think about the 22 official languages we mentioned, plus hundreds of other languages and dialects, the incredible diversity in material culture, textiles, crafts, cuisine, varying dramatically from region to region, and the multitude of festivals celebrated across different communities. Diwali, Eid, Christmas, Holi, Pongal, Gurpurab, and so many more, all embodying this unique unity and diversity concept that's so central to the idea of India.
How does this incredible diversity manage to feel like a single entity, or at least connected, across the vast subcontinent? What are the forces that bind it?
That's a great question. Historically, the movement of people has always been a key connector. Traders carrying goods and ideas along ancient routes, Pilgrims traveling to sacred sites across the land, soldiers moving with armies, scholars migrating between centers of learning. All these movements helped spread ideas, customs, languages, and fostered a sense of shared cultural space.
Anything else?
The sources also highlight something less tangible, perhaps, almost elemental. The monsoon.
The monsoon rains.
Yeah, it's described as this underlying integrating force, almost like prana, the life breath for the entire subcontinent. It affects everyone, everywhere, regardless of local culture or religion. It dictates agricultural cycles, influences moods, features prominently in art, music, literature, prayers. It's the shared, deeply embedded rhythm of life that connects people across regions in a very fundamental way.
That's a really powerful image, the climate itself as a cultural thread. And this continuity and diversity, it's maybe nowhere more visible than in India's incredible legacy of art and architecture.
Oh, absolutely. You can trace this clear lineage of artistic expression going way back. From that prehistoric art in places like Bhimbetka through the major innovations of the Mauryan period, we talked about the construction of stupas, like the Great Stupa at Sanchi, the famous polished pillars with Ashoka's insightful edicts promoting Dharma, his palace carvings.
And then later periods saw the emergence of that magnificent cave architecture, like at Ajanta and Ellora.
Yes. What stands out there is just the incredible scale and the sheer detail, intricate carvings covering vast rock faces, stunning fresco paintings depicting scenes from Buddhist Jataka tales, Hindu mythology, and everyday life. They showcase incredibly sophisticated artistic techniques for their time and reflect this deep religious fervor across Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain traditions, all often coexisting side by side.
And temple architecture itself shows such vast regional variation and evolution over centuries.
Absolutely. It's an enormous field. From the intricate, often sensuous carvings of the temples at Khajuraho or the unique astronomical alignment of the Konark Sun Temple in the north, to the towering gateways, gopurams, and complex pillared halls, mandapams, of the southern Dravidian style. Think of masterpieces like the Brihadiswar Temple at Thanjavur, the Airavatsvara Temple, or the absolutely massive Srirangamaranganath Swami Temple complex.
And then, of course, the very distinct architectural style brought by the Mughals.
Mughal architecture, world-renowned, naturally epitomized by the unparalleled beauty of the Taj Mahal. They built upon and transformed earlier architectural forms, incorporating techniques like intricate colored stone inlays, that technique known as pietra dur, and developing a defining aesthetic based on elegant symmetry, domes, arches, and motifs like flowering plants.
And that style itself was a blend.
Very much so. It beautifully blends influences from the existing traditions of Hindustan with strong elements from Persia, Iran, and even incorporating some European artistic elements that started arriving through trade and Jesuit missions during their time.
Speaking of blending influences, the sources also took a specific look at Mughal art, particularly miniature painting.
Yes, and it highlights that same theme of blending and synthesis again. Early significant works were commissioned by emperors like Akbar, for instance, the Hamzanama, which was this huge project to illustrate volumes telling heroic tales. It apparently took 15 years and a large workshop of artists to complete, between 1562 and 1577.
And beyond the imperial court, distinct regional styles developed too.
Right. Even under Mughal influence or patronage, distinct regional miniature painting styles developed, incorporating local flavors and aesthetics.
Like the Golconda style from the Deccan.
Exactly. Golconda miniatures often show influences from both northern styles like Malwa and earlier southern Vijayanagara traditions. They're known for things like relatively small figures, soft color palettes, often extensive use of gold and silver, lush depictions of plants and landscapes, and sometimes distinctive conical turbans. These often flourished under the patronage of the local sultanate rulers.
And other Deccan styles like Bijapur or Ahmadnagar.
These styles sometimes show even more pronounced local or folk influences. You see these amazing, vibrant depictions of foliage, stylized animals like peacocks, and sometimes a particular focus on depicting yoginis or emphasizing female aesthetics. Interestingly, some of these Deccan paintings even incorporated European features or motifs, perhaps hinting at Renaissance prints or paintings making their way there through trade routes. It's another testament to that constant absorption and synthesis that really defines so much of Indian culture.
This rich history of interactions, synthesis, and distinct identities brings us right up to looking at religion and society in contemporary India. And here, we can draw on some really interesting recent data.
Right. This is where the Pew Research Center survey comes in. It was a major survey conducted between late 2019 and early 2020. They interviewed nearly 30,000 people across India, in 17 different languages. It provides a really valuable snapshot of how Indians today view their religious lives, identities, and relationships with other communities.
And one of the most striking findings seems to be the high level of perceived religious freedom.
Yes, that's a major takeaway highlighted in the source. Overwhelming majorities across all the major faiths surveyed Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists, and Jains reported feeling very free to practice their religion in India.
Okay, so that's the tolerance aspect. But the data also seems to highlight something else, almost paradoxical, running alongside that freedom.
This is where it gets really nuanced and interesting. The survey also found that large numbers of Hindus and Muslims, while generally valuing tolerance in principle, simultaneously see themselves as very different from each other. There's a strong sense of separate religious identities coexisting with that widely perceived freedom to practice one's faith.
So tolerance is a core value, but maybe a preference for social segregation in practice. Is that fair?
That's pretty much how the survey frames it. Indians across different religious groups tend to highly value religious tolerance as an abstract principle, as part of India's identity. Yet, when you dig into their stated preferences for social interaction, many express a strong preference for keeping their social lives, especially close personal relationships like marriage, and even close friendships, largely within their own religious community. This points towards that tolerance alongside segregation dynamic the survey highlighted.
And this idea of separate spheres or maybe parallel systems seems to appear in discussions around law, too.
It does, yeah. The survey found that a significant number of Muslims in India expressed support for the availability of Islamic religious courts, like Sharia courts, to handle family law matters, such as inheritance or divorce, operating alongside the secular court system that applies to all citizens.
And it touched on specific practices like triple talaq.
Yes, the sources mention the historical practice of triple talaq, a form of instant divorce, historically permitted in some schools of Islamic law, predominantly the Hanafi school in India. It's worth noting the survey found that a majority of Muslim women interviewed actually opposed the practice of triple talaq. This practice has since been ruled unconstitutional by India's Supreme Court in 2017 and formally banned by legislation in 2019.
The survey also looked into the persistent issue of caste discrimination. What did it find there?
It found that awareness and personal experience of caste discrimination vary quite a bit geographically. It's reportedly higher in the southern and northeastern regions of India, and unsurprisingly, it is particularly experienced by those belonging to Dalit communities, formerly untouchables.
But despite these divisions, religious segregation, caste discrimination, the survey also found strong shared values.
Yes, that's another important finding. Despite the differences and divisions, the survey found very strong shared values across all religious groups. Things like patriotism, a strong sense of national pride, and a deep respect for elders were nearly universal across communities.
Did the study shed any light on what actually defines religious identity for people today? For example, what does it mean to be Muslim in India?
It's interesting. For Muslims in India, the survey found quite diverse views on the importance of certain practices in defining their religious identity. Things like the importance of praying daily, attending mosque regularly, or even whether it's acceptable to celebrate festivals of other religions. There wasn't universal agreement on these.
But some things were near universal.
Yes. There was near universal agreement on the importance of certain core beliefs and also on dietary rules, specifically the importance of avoiding pork.
And what about religious conversion? That's often a really politically charged topic in India, isn't it? With concerns about proselytism.
It definitely is politically charged. However, the survey's finding here was quite striking. It indicated that religious switching, meaning people converting from the religion they were raised in to another religion, actually has a minimal net impact on the overall size of religious groups in India nationally.
So not much overall change despite conversions happening.
Exactly. It suggests a high level of stability and religious affiliation at the national level. For example, the share of people raised Hindu is very similar to the share currently identifying as Hindu. This is despite the political controversy that sometimes surrounds conversion activities, particularly historical conversions of lower castes to Christianity or Buddhism, and the existence of state-level anti-proselytism laws enacted in some areas aimed at preventing forced or fraudulent conversions. The Pew data suggests little net change in the overall religious landscape results from these conversions.
The sources also briefly touched upon the link noted in the survey between religious identity and political leanings, specifically regarding support for the BJP party.
Yes, the survey reported as one of its findings that the appeal of the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, tends to be greater among Hindus who more closely associate their Hindu religious identity, and also the Hindi language, with the concept of being truly Indian. It highlights a connection between certain views of national identity and political preference, according to the data.
It's clear from all this, the long history, the diverse culture, the contemporary social dynamics, that understanding India's past is complex. And that complexity extends to how history itself is written and interpreted, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Our understanding of Indian history isn't some fixed, objective truth handed down. It has evolved significantly over time, and it continues to evolve, heavily influenced by different schools of historical thought, different perspectives, and different agendas, frankly.
Can you give us a sense of some of those different approaches to writing Indian history? What were the early ones like?
Well, inevitably, you had colonial historiography first, largely written from the British perspective during the Raj. Some figures, like James Mill in the early 19th century, presented a very influential but deeply critical view of India as stagnant, irrational, and inherently divided a view which, unfortunately, sometimes served to justify British rule as a modernizing, unifying force.
Orientalist views.
Often, yes, falling into Orientalist tropes. But it's also important to acknowledge, as the sources do, that some British scholars and administrators during that period also did undertake valuable work in documenting Indian languages, translating ancient texts, and conducting archaeological surveys, even if their interpretations were colored by their own biases.
Which naturally provoked a strong reaction from Indian scholars, particularly as the nationalist movement grew.
Exactly. Nationalist historiography emerged largely as a response, aiming to counter that colonial narrative. It focused on highlighting India's past glories, its fundamental underlying unity despite diversity, and its significant contributions to world civilization. The goal here was often to foster national pride, build a sense of shared identity, and legitimize the struggle for independence. Historians like R.C. Majumdar are often associated with this school.
And then other schools came along, focusing more on social and economic structures.
Yes, Marxist historiography became very influential in Indian academia for a period. It focused on analyzing socioeconomic structures, class struggle, different modes of production throughout Indian history, and the economic impact of colonialism. Historians like D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma, and Irfan Habib are key figures here. Then you also had the Cambridge School, which offered yet another perspective, often emphasizing local power dynamics, patronage networks, and the self-interested actions of Indian elites in collaborating with or resisting colonial rule, sometimes downplaying ideology.
And more recently, there's been a focus on bringing in marginalized voices.
Yes, the Subaltern Studies collective, which gained prominence from the 1980s onwards, represented a really significant shift. Their project was explicitly to try and write history from below, deliberately focusing on the experiences, perspectives, and agency, the ability to active marginalized groups who had often been ignored or silenced in more elite-centric historical narratives. We're talking about peasants, tribal communities, Dalits, women. Figures like Ranajit Guha were pioneers in this influential movement.
What about the most recent trends? How is Indian history being interpreted now?
Well, contemporary historical work is often characterized by being more nuanced, more interdisciplinary. It draws insights from fields like cultural history, gender studies, environmental history. There's more focus on regional histories and the complexities of multiple overlapping identities. The sources also note, importantly, the rise of interpretations influenced by Hindu nationalist perspectives, Hindutva, which sometimes actively challenge the established secular historical narratives, leading to quite heated public and academic debates about the past.
So historians clearly use different lenses, different frameworks, but they all ultimately rely on sources, on evidence. What kind of evidence do they draw from for this vast history?
An incredibly wide variety. For ancient history, archaeological evidence is crucial. Excavated sites like Harappa or Taxila provide artifacts, reveal settlement patterns, structures, giving vital insights into daily life and urban planning. Inscriptions are hugely important. Think of Ashoka's edicts carved on stone pillars or rock faces, or later copper plate grants recording land donations. These provide direct administrative, social, and religious information. Coins numismatics offer clues about rulers, dynasties, trade routes, and economic conditions.
And written records, obviously.
Absolutely fundamental. You have literary texts spanning millennia, everything from the ancient religious scriptures like the Vedas, the epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Puranas, to secular treatises on statecraft like the Arthashastra, classical plays and poetry, historical chronicles written in royal courts.
And accounts from outsiders.
critically important for providing external perspectives, even if biased. Think of the Greek ambassador Megasthenes' descriptions of the Mauryan Empire, the travelogues of Chinese Buddhist monks like Faxian and Xuanzang visiting India, or later detailed accounts from scholars like al-Biruni, who traveled with Mahmud of Ghazni, the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, or even the memoirs of the Mughal founder Babur himself, the Baburnama.
And for more modern periods.
The archival records become immense, vast collections from the colonial administration, British, French, Portuguese, and the post-colonial Indian state. Historians also increasingly use oral traditions and oral histories, collecting personal testimonies. Ethnographic studies of contemporary communities can sometimes shed light on historical practices. And of course, modern statistical data, like that Pew survey we discussed, becomes a source for understanding recent social history.
And the methodologies used to analyze all these diverse sources vary quite a bit too.
Oh yes. Depending on the historian's training, the school of thought they adhere to, and the specific type of source material, they employ a wide range of methodologies. This includes careful textual analysis and criticism, archaeological excavation techniques, statistical analysis of quantitative data, methods for collecting and interpreting oral history, ethnographic fieldwork, and applying various critical theories from social sciences or humanities to interpret the evidence.
It sounds like, despite all this evidence and analysis, there are still areas of significant debate and maybe even gaps in our knowledge about India's past.
Absolutely. History is never fully known or settled. The sources acknowledge that there are still gaps, particularly for prehistoric periods or in fully understanding and utilizing non-written oral traditions, and major historical debates continue to be actively researched and argued over.
Such as?
Oh, big questions like the nature and impact of the so-called Aryan migration, or migrations into India in the second millennium BCE, the applicability of concepts like Indian feudalism to describe medieval socioeconomic structures, the overall balance sheet of British colonialism, was it wholly extractive and damaging, or were there some unintended positive contributions alongside the exploitation? The precise causes and responsibilities for the trauma of partition remain fiercely debated, and differing assessments of post-independence leaders, policies, and their long-term consequences are ongoing.
So understanding India's past isn't just about learning a neat sequence of events. It's really about engaging with these ongoing debates, understanding the different ways evidence can be interpreted, and appreciating the complexity.
Exactly. It's a living history, constantly being re-examined, reinterpreted, and unfortunately sometimes repoliticized too.
Well, we have certainly covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive. I mean, from the remarkable urban planning of the Indus Valley Civilization thousands of years ago, and the vast centralized empires of the Mauryas and Guptas, through centuries of interaction with external forces, the transformative, often painful era of colonial rule, leading right up to the complexities of the independence struggle and the multifaceted, dynamic reality of modern India today. All it woven together with this incredibly vibrant, constantly evolving culture shaped by millennia of interaction, synthesis, and really resilience.
And if we had to pull out some common threads, some recurring themes that connect this incredibly long and diverse history, what would they be?
I think the sources point towards that constant dynamic interplay between internal evolution and external forces shaping the subcontinent.
Right.
Also, that remarkable continuity of certain cultural traditions and social structures persisting somehow alongside constant adaptation and change. And of course, the profound diversity, linguistic, religious, social, artistic, that isn't just a characteristic, but maybe the fundamental defining feature of India. And understanding this layered history, this complexity, it really isn't just an academic exercise, is it? It provides absolutely crucial context for making sense of contemporary India, its current challenges, its immense opportunities, and its unique and increasingly important position on the global stage.
Definitely. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider. We talked about that fascinating dynamic highlighted in the Pew data.
Yeah.
This coexistence of a very high value placed on religious tolerance as a core principle, existing right alongside a strong preference expressed by many people for a degree of social segregation, for keeping close personal relationships largely within their own religious group.
Tolerance and segregation, it does feel like a paradox, doesn't it?
It certainly seems that way on the surface. So the question it raises is this: how does a country with such profound historical layering, such vast internal diversity across language, religion, region, caste, you name it, and these sometimes seemingly conflicting social dynamics, How does it manage to maintain such a strong, overarching sense of cultural identity and nationhood?
That's a big question. What does India's complex, multi-layered, sometimes contradictory historical experience teach us, perhaps, about navigating unity and identity in an increasingly diverse and interconnected world like ours today?
Something definitely worth mulling over. We really hope this has given you a valuable perspective, maybe some new insights, and we absolutely encourage you to explore some of the sources we've drawn from, or perhaps delve deeper into any specific aspect of this incredible history and culture that particularly sparked your curiosity.